In 1885, the New York Herald wrote a story about how the Concord Public Library in Massachusetts had decided to ban the newest publication from renowned author Mark Twain just weeks after its release. Huckleberry Finn was described by committee members to be full of bad grammar and ignorant dialect. One called the entire book flippant, and another said that it was full of a series of events that are, quote, certainly not elevating. Within a few weeks, another paper published the author's response. Quote, "A committee of the public library of your town have condemned and excommunicated my last book and doubled its sale. This generous action of theirs must necessarily benefit me in one or two additional ways. For instance, it will deter other libraries from buying the book. And you are doubtless aware that one book in a public library prevents the sale of a sure 10 and a possible 100 of its mates. And secondly, it will cause the purchasers of the book to actually read it out of curiosity instead of merely intending to do so, after the usual way of the world and library committees, and then they will discover, to my great advantage and their own indignant disappointment, that there is nothing objectionable in the book after all." And if that doesn't make you curious enough to know this story, I'll toss in one more nugget before rolling the theme song. In 1935, another contender for the greatest American author, Ernest Hemingway, wrote that, quote, "All modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. All American writing comes from that." I'll talk about what he means on the other side of the music. I'm Jameson Olson, you're listening to Becoming the Main Character, and today we're covering one of the most controversial and most American books ever written, so let's dive right in. Okay, gang, little different note. Before I continue with this story today, I have a favor to ask, because many of you found my show due to Ben Wilson, and so you already likely know, but for any who haven't heard yet, or any listeners who aren't familiar with my friend and podcasting mentor who runs the How to Take Over the World show, Ben Wilson has been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Now, Ben and I have been friends since college. It's been almost 15 years since we first met, but our friendship has really been its strongest in the last few years as I leaned on him for guidance as I entered the world of podcasting and launched the very show you are now listening to. If you want to hear the full explanation of his situation, he released a brief episode last week explaining it. I recommend you listen to it because it's impressive what a mature perspective he has and how well he is handling it. The truth is, it is a massively uphill battle for him, but he's not giving up without a fight, so we are going to be right there to fight alongside of him. The short version that I'll share here today is that the most promising drug on the market for his specific cancer is one that insurance is refusing to cover until he's already exhausted chemotherapy as an option. But the catch-22 is that by the time chemotherapy has been exhausted and proven ineffective, he'd basically be dead. So the only other option is to pay out of pocket for tarlatamab, which is a staggering $30,000 a month. So a GoFundMe has been created to try and cover his medicine to buy him and his family some breathing room. The initial response has been heartwarming. Hundreds and hundreds of people have been chipping in, and by the time this episode is released, we may have already hit the initial target of $360,000. But when you realize that is still only enough to cover 1 year of just that one medicine, and there will be many other costs in this fight against cancer, on top of who knows how long he's going to need to be on that. So I am asking you, BTMC listeners, out of your appreciation for Ben and what he's created, if you are in a position to donate, I've linked the GoFundMe in the episode description here. If you've never heard of Ben, but you love BTMC, consider donating because BTMC wouldn't be here without the help that I received from him. And if neither of those apply, well, just consider donating out of the goodness of your heart to help a father of 4 stay in the game. He truly is one of the best embodiments of the protagonist mindset that I have the pleasure of knowing personally. So thank you in advance for your help. And with that, let's get back to the episode. There are a few things before we actually start the story. First off, what did Hemingway mean it was the book that all American modern literature is based from? Because it was by no means the first book written by an American author. Well, it turns out that is largely due to the fact that this was the first time where a major author dared to not attempt to write the narration and dialogue of his characters in very clean and proper prose like our English predecessors. It's not saying no one wrote a story that thematically was American before, but rather that it was the first book that sounded American. It defied the rules and expectations of what literature was, because instead of a narrator who guides us through the story of an uneducated boy who grew up in the boonies, the narrator is an uneducated boy who grew up in the boonies. It's a first-person narration from Huck Finn himself. Now, I will be telling the story from a third-party narrator perspective, but you'll see whenever I quote Huck how he talks, and you'll see that an entire book that sounds like that would strike people as odd or different, or in the case of that librarian, quote, a systematic use of bad grammar and an employment of inelegant expressions. In fact, the book even opens with what is titled an explanatory. Quote, in this book, a number of dialects are used, to wit, the Missouri Negro dialect, the extremist form of the backwoods Southwestern dialect, the ordinary Pike County dialect, and 4 modified varieties of this last. The shadings have not been done in haphazard fashion or by guesswork, but painstakingly and with the trustworthy guidance and support of personal familiarity with these several forms of speech. I make this explanation for the reason that without it, many readers would suppose that all these characters were trying to talk alike and not succeeding, end quote. It's raw, it's unapologetic, and it, as Hemingway points out, is the first American book that dared to do so. And with that comes the first big reason why it's controversial. It's that word. You know the one tied to slavery and African Americans in general. Yeah, that one. It's in here a lot, like over 200 times. But what surprised me as I read it was that when I think of the N-word being used in media, I think of it being used by racist characters who are spitting vitriol and hatred, or being used by fellow African characters who use it like their secret club password. But what I wasn't ready for was how in Huck Finn, it's not used in any way other than an adjective. Obviously, I'm not going to be saying it in my episodes, but basically anytime I use the word slave, black man, African American, or maybe Negro, just know that the book is definitely using the N-word in that instance. And I'm not excusing it, just stating that I found it surprising that it was used that many times in such a casual and unassuming manner. So the reason it was controversial early on was actually less to do with its racial stereotypes and more with the fact that it portrayed lowlifes like an uneducated boy as heroic figures. And the use of that word also did play into the fact that most of the northern part of the country was becoming more sensitive to it, but its controversy has taken on new shades in recent decades. Because I'd say much like To Kill a Mockingbird, when this book came out, it was largely seen as an anti-slavery book with anti-racist rhetoric. The main character is friends with an African-American slave, and, well, if you're not familiar, I don't want to give too much away just yet, but you'll see. But as much as the storyline may have some elements of inclusion and anti-racist sentiment, black characters in this book are largely portrayed as very unintelligent. Not just uneducated, but kind of minstrel show levels of exaggeration in their mannerisms, dialect, and their levels of superstition. I've toned down the dialect in my episode largely just because I want to make sure you guys can understand what I'm saying, but also because it just felt weird for me to try and repeat the levels of ignorant speech that Twain portrayed many of the slaves as having. So many today don't like the book because it casts this image of blacks being unintelligent. Myself, I wasn't around in the South during slavery, so I don't know exactly what slaves sounded like. Twain was, so I tend to think he had some access to truth, but what is more important, in my opinion, is that if stories that address ugly truths don't make us uncomfortable, then that means we're probably polishing the ugliness just to make it go down smoother. And as much as anyone may hate the characterization of any race being seen as unintelligent compared to another, I find myself thinking that to pretend that any race of people who was subjugated for generations, forbidden of having access to education, and even beaten for simply holding a book, would tend to put them at a disadvantage in terms of society and intellect. And if we don't accept that and get comfortable with realizing it has happened in the past, we run the risk of letting it happen again. So this is not a perfect novel in several ways, but it does capture the essence of its time in a way that is important for us to not forget. So in short, this book may be challenging depending on your sensitivities. I believe my portrayal is a much easier version to digest for the reasons I've already stated, but you still might find yourself unhappy with a few scenes where people who may not even have true malice in their hearts still treat the slave characters as subhuman because that was just the reality of life back then. So if you're willing to accept that, I think there are some beautiful themes and lessons to explore in this book. But if you find yourself thinking my episode is still too offensive on any of those fronts, I wouldn't recommend reading the book because I've toned it down quite a bit. I do have a couple more things before we launch in the first chapter. I don't think I've had this much pre-story context since I did Fellowship of the Ring, but the story takes place in what is known as the antebellum period of the South. Now, the word antebellum is literally just Latin for pre-war. So it's basically the South during the 1800s before the Civil War broke out, and it was a very distinct culture. I'm going to try to describe it briefly in as objective of a way as I can, but I have enough friends from southern states that I'm sure any southern listeners may take issue with some of it. But the way I describe it is the way that Twain wrote about it, so I have that backing going for me at least. The antebellum era was a picture of slower life, mostly agrarian, but with a culture that saw itself as genteel, chivalrous, and rooted in honor and tradition. This was in stark contrast to the fast-moving, industrializing, and immigrant-filled northern states. And this is where we get the large plantation houses with columns, formal manners, men challenging each other to duels, and proper courtship of the women. One definition I saw said that the period borrowed its self-mythology from European feudal romance, which Twain really hated. And we'll talk about that more throughout the episode. But here was the problem with this image. On the surface, it was a beautiful thing, almost a dream state where everyone was polite and followed rules and codes of conduct, a utopia of sorts. But that entire engine was fueled by slavery. The reason the plantation owners could make so much money while living such gentle lives built on hospitality and leisure was because slave labor was doing much of the work to fuel it. It was an ugly side of the culture that most people just condition themselves to not look directly at. This need for separation between the life of a southern lord or lady and the commoners and slaves who did all the work maybe even is what drove the more inhumane treatment of slaves, because it would be easier to not feel guilty about slavery the more that you just didn't even see them as humans. And we'll see a couple different examples in the story of when Twain really took aim at this perceived hypocrisy in this society. And the last thing before I actually start the book is to address that this is, in a sense, a sequel, because years before The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was published, we got The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and the roles were reversed. Huck was a supporting character in Tom's story, and Tom is now a supporting character in Huck's story. That fact is what makes it even more interesting to me that this was the first novel written in this American way. But if you pick up a copy of Tom Sawyer, it is written in a traditional third-person narration without the full submersion into the bad grammar that we get with Huck Finn. So, to set us off, here is a brief plot summary of Tom Sawyer that will help you understand the world at the time when Chapter 1 kicks off. And if this little section sounds like AI, it's because I did just ask Claude to give it to me. I already put way too much time in scripting these episodes, so get over it. In The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Tom lived with his Aunt Polly in the fictional Mississippi River town of St. Petersburg, Missouri, getting into a string of loosely connected boyhood scrapes. From conning the neighborhood kids into whitewashing a fence for him, to courting Becky Thatcher, dodging school and church, the real plot kicked in when Tom and Huck snuck into a graveyard at midnight to try a wart-curing superstition, and there they witnessed Injun Joe murder the town doctor, framing the drunk Muff Potter for it. Terrified, the boys swore a blood oath to keep the secret. Huck's whole role in that book was being Tom's partner in carrying that secret. He'd been introduced as the son of the town drunk. He had no mother, an absent father, no school, no church. He slept wherever he pleased and answered to nobody. The respectable townsfolk saw Huck as a bad influence, which was exactly why every other boy in town envied him. He was total freedom from civilization's rules. Tom eventually testified at Muff Potter's trial and cleared him, but Injun Joe escaped. Later, Tom and Becky got lost in a cave where Tom discovered Injun Joe was hiding out. And after they escaped, the cave was sealed with Joe inside. Tom and Huck had been tracking Joe because he was guarding buried treasure, and once he was gone, the boys recovered it, splitting $12,000 between them. That windfall is exactly where this book, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, picks up. Now suddenly rich, Huck has been taken in by the widow Douglas, who set about trying to civilize him by giving him new clothes, teaching him manners, taking him to church, and that's the exact condition Huck is chafing against on page 1 of his own book. Okay, shall we begin? Actually, I do have one more tiny thing, but it's literally in the book before the first page of chapter 1. It's not an intro, it's not even an epigraph, it's labeled Notice. And it's just a warning from the author that feels pretty targeted at me, actually, but it just is another example of the sharp wit of Mark Twain. Quote, persons attempting to find a motive in this narrative will be prosecuted. Persons attempting to find a moral in it will be banished. Persons attempting to find a plot in it will be shot. By order of the author. Well, Mr. Twain, best start finding a way to banish me, because here I go again, looking for morals. Okay, now I can really promise. Let's begin Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Keeping in mind that this whole book is written from Huck's perspective, he starts by saying that after the adventures of Tom Sawyer's story, Judge Thatcher invested both of their money and allowed each of them to withdraw $1 a day allowance in interest. Now, based on inflation alone, the modern equivalent of these sums equals roughly $250,000 in terms of the total amount. But once again, I feel like just adjusting for inflation doesn't capture how big of a deal this money was, so I decided to run it off of a different metric, median income. So if we call median income today $60,000, this is not quite 4 years worth of salary in Fortune, but back then a laborer averaged more like $300 a year, meaning that this money was 20 years worth of salary. Now, I don't need to belabor the point more, but I just need you to understand that when an author back then picked a number, just adjusting for inflation probably won't be enough to capture what their intent was in picking that, because $6,000 was life-changing money back then. And even Huck's $1 a day allowance, again, if you just adjust for inflation, is about $40 a day. But again, if you were to focus more on the actual impact, it felt like a lot more than that. But I don't need to waste more time justifying the value of money to you. The point is that now he's in the possession of this wealth. The widow Douglas had taken an interest in the poor lost lamb that was Huckleberry Finn, the uneducated, motherless son of an abusive drunk and absentee father. So, in Huck's words, she thought she would civilize him. And just so you know, civilize is ironically misspelled for emphasis here. But she put him in respectable clothes, taught him manners, and made him go to school, but oftentimes that got to be too much for Huck. And he would sneakily dress in his old rags and climb through the window to experience life as he was familiar with it, which often meant playing with his best friend, Tom Sawyer. But the nights where he couldn't get away, he was stuck being proper with the widow. And one such night is explained like this, quote, after supper, she got out her book and learned me about Moses and the bulrushers, and I was in a sweat trying to find out all about him. But by and by, she let out that Moses had been dead a considerable long time, so then I didn't care no more about it because I don't take no stock in dead people. That line on the first pages is a prime example of Huck. He is an uneducated pragmatist. If things don't make sense to him, he just doesn't take interest in them. He feels like it's hypocritical that the widow won't let him smoke his pipe, and yet she does snuff all the time, but he can at least see that the widow is trying to do what she thinks is right for him. But the real problem isn't the widow Douglas, it's her sister that gets under his skin. Miss Watson. She had recently come to live with her sister, and by Huck's estimate, Miss Watson existed just to mess with him. Huckleberry, don't put your feet up there. Huckleberry, don't scrunch up like that. Huckleberry, why don't you try to behave? She said the way I live is wicked. She said she wouldn't live like me because she was going to the good place. Well, I couldn't see no advantage in going where she was going, so I made up my mind that I wouldn't try for it. And honestly, who can blame a boy when Miss Watson described the good place as where you go around all day with a harp singing praises forever and ever? Doesn't sound like much fun to a young boy, does it? But one time, Huck asked Miss Watson if she thought Tom Sawyer would go to the good place. When she scoffed and said there was no chance, Huck was secretly glad because he wanted to go to the same place as Tom. One night, as Huck contemplated his plight of the uncivilized, hell-bound child living among saintly women, there was a meow at his window just after midnight. After a couple more suspiciously non-cat-like meows, he ran to the window and climbed down to the ground, where he was met by none other than Tom Sawyer. Tom led Huck around the house, but they froze as they got near the kitchen door, because there was Miss Watson's slave, Jim, sitting up against the steps of the door, tired from his day's work. He had been alerted to a small sound that Huck had made, so that made him come to a stop. "Who's that?" They froze as they watched Jim crane his neck around, trying to spot the source of the noise. Huck's ankle itched like crazy, but he didn't dare move. "Who are you? Where are you? I know I done heard something. Well, I'm gonna just sit down here and listen till I hear it again." Tom and Huck stayed put until Jim's watchfulness faded into soft snores from the kitchen steps. With the way now clear, Tom snuck into the kitchen and took a handful of candles. He left a nickel on the counter so no one could call it theft. On his way out, Tom wanted to tie Jim to a tree as a joke, but Huck wasn't about it. Sawyer was feeling far too mischievous to do nothing, however, so he took Jim's hat and hung it from a limb of the tree above him. He chuckled as he told Huck about it. Jim would definitely think it had been some witches that had been up to no good while he was asleep. The two boys continued on and met up with another half-dozen local kids from town. They borrowed a skiff and floated down the river a couple miles until they got to a spot where Tom had wanted to go, because there was a cave. It felt more like a hole in the hillside, but it would become their secret hideout. "Now, we'll start this band of robbers and call it Tom Sawyer's Gang," he said. "Everybody that wants to join has got to take an oath and write his name in blood." He then pulled out a sheet where he had written the entire oath. It didn't just say that anyone who betrayed the band would be killed. It said that another gang member would be assigned to slit their throat, burn their carcass, and spread the ashes all around, and that the assigned gang member could not rest until this was completed. Some of the boys suggested that a betrayer should not only have himself killed, but his entire family. Most agreed, but that raised the question of if Huck Finn should be allowed to join. "He ain't got no family." "Well, he's got a father, ain't he?" "Yeah, but his paps is never around." Huck thought about it for a moment and then suggested they could count Miss Watson as his family. No, this is not his actual caretaker, but her spinster sister that annoys him. "Oh, she'll do," the boys said. "Huck can join." One boy named Ben Rogers asked Tom after they had all signed the deed with blood, "What's the line of business of this gang, anyhow?" Tom had a playfully wicked smile on his face as he said, "Aw, nothing. Only robbery and murder," he said. "We gonna rob cows?" one boy asked. "Stealing cattle ain't robbery, it's burglary," Tom snapped. "And we ain't burglars, we are highwaymen. We stop stages and carriages on the road while wearing masks and kill people for their watches and money." "Do we have to kill people?" someone asked. "Oh, absolutely," Tom asserted. "It's best to kill any witnesses, unless you take them hostage for ransom." The boys continued to elaborate on just how cutthroat the Tom Sawyer gang was going to be, but then they turned to the most important question of all. What was their schedule going to be like? Ben Rogers said he could only get out on Sundays, but some of the others objected to the idea of stealing and murdering on the Lord's Day. In the end, they voted to figure out what day worked best after they'd all had time to sleep on it. And just as the first rays of light were starting to climb over the horizon, Huck climbed back through his window, tired as a zombie, but knowing he'd have to get up in an hour or two. The next morning, Miss Watson was disgusted at the state of Huck's clothes, covered in grease and clay. She told him to go pray while she tried to clean them, but Huck said he didn't see much use in praying. Miss Watson had told him several times that you could receive anything you prayed for, but he tried that once when he had a fishing line and no hooks, so he prayed multiple times for some hooks. And when nothing came, he asked Miss Watson to pray for hooks for him, but she told him he was a fool. This had led to him asking the widow Douglas about prayer, where she clarified that prayer was actually useful for spiritual gifts. And this was all too much for Huck. But the widow tried to explain what exactly she meant, saying that Huck was supposed to only look to help other people and do everything in his power for them, never thinking of himself. What annoyed Huck most about this statement was the realization that Miss Watson surely was among the list of other people that he was supposed to look after. So after the forming of the gang, they would meet occasionally, but it didn't take long for the boys to start losing interest, because in that time they hadn't robbed anybody or killed anybody either. The most they'd ever done was chase after cart drivers pretending to be in an ambush, but they never actually attacked anybody. But that didn't stop Tom from creating stories about their exploits, tales of how many they'd killed and all the jewelry and gold they'd stolen. The greatest story he had told was when planning their next adventure, he claimed that his scouts had warned him that Spanish merchants and rich Arabs were hiding in the hollow nearby with hundreds of elephants and camels. They had a hoard of gold and diamonds, and this fired the boys up for an ambush, but when they charged over the hill, they didn't find one Spaniard, Arab, elephant, or camel, just a Sunday school class picnic full of kids. The gang were at least going to make off with some hymn books and donuts, but then the adults shooed them off. And when Huck asked Tom about the fact that he hadn't seen a single diamond on their ambush, Tom just sighed heavily, saying if Huck weren't so ignorant, he would have read Don Quixote, and he would have known for himself that all of this was done by enchantment. After talking for another hour about how enchantment can be used to drum up magicians and magic lamps with genies, Huck decided that Tom Sawyer's lies may work for him, but as far as Huck was concerned, being told to believe in a bunch of stories that he couldn't see for himself didn't feel any different from Sunday school. Okay, I'm going to cut in here and give you a bit more of a bio on our author, Mark Twain, or as he was born, Samuel Langhorne Clemens. And both this book and Tom Sawyer are based on his own childhood. Maybe not the specific adventures, but the world building, because St. Petersburg, Missouri is just a fictionalization of the town he grew up in called Hannibal, Missouri, which does sit right on the Mississippi River. He lived in Hannibal from the ages of 4 to 17, meaning that all of his boyhood memories are from there. A lot of the locales are based on his actual experiences, like the cave outside of town that Tom Sawyer took his gang to. Although someone not familiar with the details of Twain's life might look at a picture of him and think, oh, he's a Southern man through and through, he actually lived in many different places, including quite a bit in New England and in the Wild West states like Nevada and California during the years of the Civil War. The first time he actually was published was, in fact, a short story called The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, which is a spot in California, which this piece was published in 1865. And a fun fact, that town county still hosts a Jumping Frog Jubilee every year, partially due to the fame that that story brought it. And I think for paid subscribers, just FYI, I'm going to read that story for you in a bonus episode because it's fun to see where Twain started out. So stay tuned and link in description for anyone who wants to sign up for that. But Twain would write a handful of incredibly popular novels outside of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. He also wrote The Prince and the Pauper and A Connecticut, Yankee, and King Arthur's Court. He was more than just an author. He was a public figure in a way that few writers had ever figured out before. We've already read one of his witty rebuttals in the form of newspaper articles, and we'll cover more of his sarcastic responses to critics of his work later. He was in many ways one of the first authors who understood the value of a personal brand. He knew the more that newspapers wrote about him, the more books he would sell. So why not do and say things that would be worthy of editorials and gossip columns? His sense of humor almost exclusively was aimed at pointing out hypocrisies that he felt he saw in institutions and systems of belief that were actually not helpful in his eyes. Religious piety made him cringe. The Southern honor code that played at refinement while perpetuating violence was a particular sore spot for him, as we've already touched on. He didn't care if you liked him, though, and that was what made him so magnetic. He was unapologetically Mark Twain. And that is a big reason why the most prestigious award given for humor and comedy in America is named the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor. Let's get back to the world he created. Ever since living with the widow, Huck had been forced to attend school, and at first he hated it. Then he got to where he could tolerate it, but even then, he still found himself needing a break from it once in a while. And there was one particular morning where he accidentally knocked over the salt container at breakfast. He tried to grab some of it so he could toss it over his left shoulder like he had been taught to do in the superstitious ways, but Miss Watson caught him first and swept up the salt before he could ward off the bad luck. This was not a good start to his day. Something bad was going to happen. And it was after breakfast that Huck went out around the garden wall and noticed tracks in the dirt. There was too much vegetation to get clear prints, but there was enough for him to pick up the direction, and so he followed. And when he finally got a full print, his heart sunk a bit. The print had a little cross in it, which is an effect that you got by hammering nails into the heel, and it was intended to ward off the devil. Now, it's not that this was a practice that belonged to one man, but Huck seeing that print so close to where he lived could only mean one thing. So he ran straight to Judge Thatcher's place, the only real legal authority in St. Petersburg, and the man who managed his financial affairs. Huck was out of breath and wheezing as the judge told him that he'd just received another half-year's interest payment on Huck's $6,000, totaling more than $150, but he'll keep reinvesting that with the principal. I don't care about the money, Huck heaved. In fact, keep it. The judge was puzzled. "What's wrong?" he asked. Nothing. Just take it, please, and don't ask me nothing. Then I won't have to tell no lies." Thinking he'd fixed his big problem in his own mind, Huck took off, but it was only after the judge had given him $1 for his daily allowance. So Huck ran home again, and this time he found Jim, and he decided to ask him a favor. Now, Jim had an old hairball from an ox's stomach, which supposedly worked like an oracle that many slaves went to Jim asking for their fortunes. Huck had been known to do this a time or two as well. "Jim," Huck said, "Pap is back. I need to know what he's up to." Jim did a ritual with the hairball before telling Huck that Huck's pap has 2 angels floating above him. One is shiny white and the other is black. Neither one of them can keep control for long. He said a bunch of other things that really didn't help Huck understand his situation at all, so he left and went home. It was dark, so he lit a candle as he went up to his room, and as soon as he turned around after shutting the door behind him, there was Pap, waiting for him. "I used to be scared of Pap," Huck writes. "He used to beat me so often, and sure enough, I was scared when I turned around and seen him sitting there in my room. But once the initial spook wore off, I realized I weren't scared of him worth bothering about." Pap is described to us as being about 50, and he looks like it, so maybe because of how longevity has increased, imagine he looks more like 60 now. Long, greasy, tangled hair that hung down in front of his eyes, making it hard to see him. His skin was so white it looked sickly, and he wore rags. One of his boots was even worn out enough that you could see a couple toes sticking out of it. "Well, look at them clothes," he said. "You think you're a good deal of a big bug, don't you?" Huck looked at the ground while trying to sound confident, saying, "Maybe I am, maybe I ain't." "Don't you give me none of your lip. You got fancy since I've been away, and I aim to take you down a peg before I'm done with you. They says you's educated, too, reading and writing. You think you're better than your father because he can't read? I'll take it out of you. Who told the widow she could tell you what to do anyhow? I'll learn her to meddle in a man's affairs. You're done going to school here. Your mama couldn't read or write, and here you is thinking you're special. Well, let me hear you read." Huck cautiously picked up a book and started reading out loud about General George Washington, but after 30 seconds, Pap knocked the book out of his hand with a scoff. "Well, ain't you a sweet-scented dandy," Pap mocked. "You got bedclothes and carpet on your floor. They tell me you're rich. How's that?" he said. "They lie," Huck said flatly. "That's how." "Don't you lie to me, boy. Everybody I done talked to lately says you got thousands of dollars in gold. I want that money, and tomorrow you're going to get it for me." "I ain't got no money," Huck said. "You think I'm stupid? I know Judge Thatcher's holding on to it, so you're going to ask him for it." He then demanded whatever money Huck had on him right now, so Huck reached in and handed over the $1 that the judge had given him earlier. Pap then got up and said he was headed to town. He hadn't had a drink all day. Huck didn't sleep well that night. It felt like the storm was just beginning to brew. If only he'd been able to toss some of that salt over his shoulder. The next day, Huck heard all about how Pap had been drunk when he showed up at Judge Thatcher's door demanding his money, saying any money found by his boy was his by right. He caused enough of a ruckus that he got thrown in jail for a week. But a week wasn't nearly long enough for Huck. Once he got out again, Pap kept going to the courts to try and force Judge Thatcher to hand over the money. He also kept telling Huck to stop going to school. "I didn't want to go to school much before," he says, "but I reckon I'd go now just to spite Pap." Somehow, Pap managed to get a trial on the schedule to make the case for the money, and in the meantime, he kept harassing Huck for his allowance to get drunk off of. Since Huck never really felt like he had use for the money, he figured it was better to just keep the peace by handing over $2 or $3 whenever Pap came around. But his old man kept lurking around the widow's place like a leering dog. The widow warned him that if he didn't leave, she'd make trouble for him, but that only made Pap angrier. He slouched off, yelling something about how he would show the world who was Huck Finn's boss. It wasn't too much longer before Huck was walking home from school one day when Pap sprung out of a ditch and kidnapped him. He tied him up and threw him on a skiff that then sailed down the river for a few miles until they got to an old log hut that Pap had apparently made his home. The cabin was buried deep in a wood so thick you'd never find it unless you knew where to look. Pap didn't let Huck go out of his sight, so he couldn't run off. They spent months living in that cabin. Pap locked the cabin night and day so Huck couldn't leave, and he slept with the key either under his pillow or in his pocket. Most days they just fished and hunted for their food, but once in a while, Pap would lock Huck inside while he walked the several miles to the only store in the area to trade fish for whiskey. He was always drunk when he got back from those trips, and he'd give Huck a beating. Eventually, the widow found out where they were, and she sent a man to collect Huck, but Pap just chased him off with his rifle. The strange part was, Huck kind of came to like it. Sure, the beatings weren't good, and Pap was always a generally sour person to be around, but in reality, he spent his days smoking and fishing with no homework, no prayers, and above all, no Miss Watson. Now, this was kind of the life. Until one day, Pap's drunk beating went too far, and Huck described it as he got too handy with his hickory, leaving welts all over Huck's body, which was when he decided he couldn't stay like this forever. But how was he going to escape? If Pap was around, he couldn't do anything because Pap could chase him down. And when Pap was gone, Huck was locked in the cabin. The windows were no bigger than his own head, and the chimney was too narrow to climb up out of. But once when Pop was in town, after scouring the entire cabin for a tool, Huck came up with something half useful. It was a rusty wood saw without a handle, just a piece of serrated metal. So he picked a spot in the cabin that was covered up by furniture. He moved the furniture out of the way and started sawing out the bottom log. That day, he made good progress before he heard Pap's gun go off in the distance, so he brushed all the sawdust into a corner and covered up his work. Quote, when he got back, Pap warn't in a good humor, so he was his natural self, which I think is one of the better lines of this book. But it turns out Pap was so angry because Judge Thatcher had been employing his tricks to keep the trial from ever happening, and that the widow was claiming she was going to launch her own trial to get custody of Huck. This made Pap launch into a tirade against the government, or the government, as he called it. They're always ready to take a man's son away from him, a man's own son. Here's what the law does. The law takes a man worth $6,000 and upwards and jams him into an old trap of a cabin like this and lets him go around in clothes that ain't fitting for a hog. They call that a government. A man can't get his rights in a government like this. Sometimes I have a mighty notion to just leave the country for good and all. Pap continued to get more and more drunk, which made him more and more angry at the government, at Judge Thatcher, even at Huck. He ended up smashing his shin on a corner and started hopping around, cussing and hollering, but he kept drinking. Huck had seen this before. Soon Pap would be blind drunk and would pass out. So he thought once his father was unconscious, he would slip the key out of his pocket and make an escape. The problem was it took so long for him to pass out that Huck had fallen asleep himself, only to wake up to a spine-chilling scream because Pap was having a nightmare in a delirium that he was hallucinating that a snake was crawling all over him. He swung and lashed out. Huck, fearing for his own life, grabbed the gun and prepared to defend himself if necessary. Pretty soon, though, Pap tired and fell back asleep. Huck, too frightened, kept the rifle aimed in Pap's general direction, just in case. Get up! What are you about? Huck woke from his seated position to see an agitated and hungover Pap angrily asking why he had the gun pointed where he had been sleeping. Luckily, Pap had passed out near the door, so Huck whipped up a story about how men had tried to break in during the night and he couldn't wake Pap no matter how hard he tried. So he was just doing whatever it took to be ready in case the door caved. Pap took a deep breath and decided that was acceptable enough, but then the next time, make sure to wake him. He then told Huck to go check the fishing lines for some breakfast, so Huck obediently walked to the river to check the lines, cursing himself for having fallen asleep instead of escaping. But as he waded into the water, he looked upstream and saw something in the distance that got his attention. Something was floating towards him. Based on the color alone, he assumed it was a log at first, but as it got closer, it became even more useful because it was a canoe, a nice 13-foot-long drift canoe. Huck waded out to grab it and brought it to the shore, first thinking he'd win some points with Pap for having caught such a prize, but then a better idea struck him. Instead of running away where Pap might overtake him, he could float away and make more mileage before Pap even noticed he was gone. So instead of parking it by the fishing lines, he floated down just a couple hundred yards until he got to a little gully where he could hide the canoe under the branches. Pap had gone off to try and find a bird to shoot, so Huck thought he had some time, but every few seconds he could have sworn he heard Pap's footsteps behind him. But he successfully hid the canoe and then ran back to collect their fish. He quickly started prepping them so that whenever Pap came back, he wouldn't be suspicious of what was going on. As the day went by, Huck's mind raced about the cleanest way to make an escape, because Sure, the next time Pap went to town and locked him up, he would grab the saw blade and finish his work to get outside. The answer seemed pretty obvious. The next time Pap went to town and locked him up, he would grab the saw blade and finish his work, get outside, and then he would take some provisions and simply float away. But as long as that money was in Huck's name, he knew Pap would never give up looking for him. He needed to truly disappear, and that's when it hit him. I have to fake my own death. So he waited patiently until the next time Pap locked him in, saying he'd be back in a day or so. It took Huck all the patience he had to wait for an hour to be sure Pap wasn't still loitering around the cabin before he grabbed the saw blade, finished cutting a hole in the bottom log, and then he began the real work. It started by taking the wood axe that was outside and smashing in the door, staging a break-in. Then Huck used the rifle to kill a wild pig that he dragged inside to spill blood all over the cabin. He tossed furniture around, broke some things, and then dipped the axe blade in blood and pulled out some of his hairs to stick to the blade. Pretty genius in a time without DNA testing. And once he had disposed of the pig's body in the river, he dragged the canoe up to the bank by the house and began to fill it with anything and everything he might need. He moved quickly because his brain constantly imagined Pap returning for one reason or another. It was getting dark when Huck was finally ready, and he knew exactly where he'd be going. Jackson's Island. It was an island not too far from St. Petersburg, but he knew for a fact nobody lived on it, so he could hide out there just fine until he got bored or had a better idea of where to go. Huck shoved off and let the current take him towards the mighty Mississippi. He laid out in the canoe and lit his pipe, staring into the inky black sky, marveling at how bright the stars seemed after having been cooped up in a cabin for months. The sky looks ever so deep when you lay down on your back in the moonshine. I'd never known it before. When the low rumbling of the Mississippi reached his ears, he sat up and grabbed his paddle. Jackson's Island was uninhabited because it was in the middle of the Great River, and it wasn't big enough to sustain a town, but it was densely forested enough to hide someone who didn't want to be found. Huck used the moonlight to navigate the river until he reached the east side of the island. He knew a dead space where the current wouldn't reach, and he could hole up the canoe there. He looked out as small twinkling lights marked the passing of steamboats and ferries and lumber rafts up and down the watery highway that was the Mississippi. He could hear workers yelling orders as a ship would pass by his hiding place. The first gray of morning had just reached the sky when Huck finally got tired enough that he decided to get some sleep. Huck settled into solo life pretty quickly. He knew how to get fish, and he'd stolen a lot of other supplies from the cabin, so he was sitting pretty as he enjoyed the sunshine and fresh air after months stuffed in a musty old hut. It was only a matter of a half day before he started hearing distant booms, and he'd wondered if this would happen. Steamboats were going up and down the river, firing cannons over the water. Now, this is a wild thing to learn, but before we had the capabilities to drag a river for a corpse, there were other practices that were used, including one that stemmed from old British beliefs that a gun fired over a corpse would cause the ship to reverberate with enough force that any corpses underneath or near the ship would rupture their gallbladder, which would be enough to make the corpse float to the surface. And this belief was prominent enough that it made its way over to America, where not only did Mark Twain know it was a common enough thing that he could include in his book, but that the character Huck was not only not surprised, but he half expected this, that once Pap would find his son supposedly dead, but with no body to be recovered, he would go to town, and the local ferries or steamboats would fire cannons trying to find his corpse. Another wild superstition mentioned in this book, there was a belief that if you hollowed out a loaf of bread and put quicksilver in it, which quicksilver is just mercury, the loaf would float along and then stop when it was hovering over a sunken body. Now keep in mind, the idea is that the mercury being liquid at room temperature, you'd hollow out the top, I guess, and then you'd put the mercury liquid in and somehow it would sense the body. I don't know, it was a wild time, but keep in mind, this was less than 200 years ago that we believed things like this. But not only did Huck watch as the steamboats floated up and down on both sides of the island firing cannons, but he eventually even noticed a loaf of bread floating towards the shore. He ran down and scooped it up, pulled the breaded plug out of the top, and poured out the mercury before beginning to munch on the loaf. And he laughed to himself as he realized that technically the trick had worked, and he had been found. He watched as ships combed the river, searching parties looking over the railings for a sign of a body. he made sure to stay hidden in the tree line anytime anyone floated by. And as the day came to a close, the search party slowed and eventually disappeared. Huck breathed a sigh of relief. And once it was dark enough for the smoke to not stand out against the sky, he lit a fire and settled in to his new life. Over the next few days, he explored the entire island. He was effectively Lord Commander of Jackson's Island as far as he was concerned. He found grapevines and blackberry bushes. He was set up pretty nicely. He did have a run-in with a snake that taught him the island was not a total paradise, but he knew how to be careful. And one night, after dark, he even ventured to the Illinois side of the river, but was startled back when he hears a group of men on horseback that sends him scuttling back to his private island. When he landed on Jackson's Island again, however, something felt off. So he grabbed his gun and set off into the woods to hide and observe. After an hour or more of scouting, he did find something. There was another campfire that was not his. He prowled around the edge of the firelight, gun in hand, staring at a figure who was laying next to the fire wrapped in a blanket. Huck waited patiently for the person to move until the sun had started to come up. Eventually, the figure stirred. It unwrapped itself from the blanket and stretched, which is when the smile ran across Huck's face. "Hello, Jim," he yelled out. The man jumped out of his skin to hear his own name coming on what he believed to be a deserted island. But eventually his eyes landed on Huck, who was climbing out of the bushes, and he felt relief for one moment, only to return to fear when he remembered Huck was supposed to be dead. "Don't hurt me. I ain't never done no harm to a ghost. I always liked dead people." Huck laughed and said he was alive, holding out his arm so Jim could touch it. Once Jim's mind was set at ease, Huck learned that Jim had been here for a few days as well, only without all the supplies that Huck had. He basically had a blanket and the berries that he could find. So Huck takes him back to his camp, Jim peppering him with questions all the while. "How long you been here, Huck? If that wasn't your blood they found, who was it?" Huck answered all of them before making his own set of questions. Mainly, "How did you come to be here, Jim?" The black man got real quiet and almost started to shake. You won't tell anybody if I tell you." "You know I ain't a rat," Huck said, slightly offended. "Okay, well," Jim paused. "Huck, I run off." "Jim!" Huck yelled. "You said you won't tell nobody," Jim retorted anxiously. Huck was speechless. I won't tell nobody, Jim, even if they call me a low-down abolitionist." "But why, Jim? Why?" Jim then tells Huck a story of how, around the time Huck had been killed, some slave traders from Orleans had come into town looking to buy some men. He'd overheard Miss Watson and the widow Douglas talking with them, and to his horror, he heard them agree to sell him. They had offered Miss Watson $800. The women seemed kind of sad to accept, Jim said, but he knew that times had been harder on them, and apparently they felt like they needed the money. But Jim didn't stick around to find out what would happen next. He had a wife and kids, and even though running away didn't have good implications for them sticking together as a family, being dragged 1,000 miles to New Orleans was a surefire way to split them up for good. So he just ran. He tells Huck in detail about all the hiding and avoiding he had to do to eventually get on the island where he's been hiding for the last few days, without much more than a hope and a prayer of ever seeing his family again. There seems to be only one plan on the table for him: make it to a free state like Ohio and work himself to the bone until he has enough money to buy his family. "I own myself, and I'm worth $800, so I hear. I wish I had that money now," Jim said, trailing off, with a sadness in his voice. One more piece of context that I think will help make this world feel more understandable and real for you is understanding life on the Mississippi, because it was its own thing in this era. It's an extra layer to the antebellum South that I already described, that when multiplied by the Mississippi River just makes that time and place feel like a very unique fictional world. At the time of this novel, which is in the 1840s roughly, and it was only written about 40 years later than that, there were no trains out west. Any big city in the West today, if it existed back then, it was nothing more than a small town at the time. America largely stopped with the states on the west side of the Mississippi River. And without planes, trains, or automobiles, the invention of the steamboat turned the river into the lifeblood of any state that shared a border. The river runs the entire length of the country, essentially, and Missouri is actually a special state because it's along the Missouri border that both The Missouri River and the Ohio River confluence into the Mississippi, making the rest of its journey south effectively the watershed of the three largest rivers in the U.S. into one. With the river being the main means of transportation of both people and cargo, that meant all trade went up and down the river. Many of the largest cities in the Midwest were built on the banks of the river because of the access. In smaller towns like Hannibal or St. Petersburg, as it's been fictionalized, the arrival of the daily steamship was the biggest event to happen. It meant mail, it meant maybe people selling goods, maybe it meant your grandma was coming to visit. The river was a culture of its own, and that's what makes it almost its own character inside the story of Huck and Jim. Now, as a team of two, they did a more detailed combing of the island, and to their surprise, they found a cave, deep enough to protect them from the elements, and tall enough for Jim to stand up in. Luckily, it wasn't inhabited by any large animals, so they moved in with all of their provisions, and just in time, too, because before long, a massive storm rolled in and drenched the entire island. The wind howled outside their cave as they sat wrapped in blankets staring out at the torrential downpour. They sat inside, eating fish and cornbread, content as can be. The storm lasted long enough and dropped enough rain that the water level rose on the island. The two runaways would paddle around in Huck's canoe, exploring the changes in terrain due to the water levels rising. One day, they saw a large lumber raft floating along, abandoned, and they captured it, bringing it back to the island, thrilled at the new acquisition. Now they not only had a canoe to maneuver in, they had a raft that could take them down the river. And then another night, they spotted a 2-story frame house, which just read that as a cheap house made out of wood. Half submerged, but slowly floating down the river. It must have been built on the riverbank and gotten washed away by the storm. They boarded their canoe and went exploring. They actually climbed into the house through the 2nd-story window because the first floor was underwater. Almost immediately, they see a body lying in the corner. "Hello, you," Jim called out. There was no answer. Jim walked over to investigate. He poked at the man who didn't move. He rolled him over, and Huck heard a gasp before Jim walked back over solemnly and said the man was dead, shot in the back. "Dead for a couple days at least." He warned Huck not to look. It was too ghastly. The room was littered with cheap playing cards, empty whiskey bottles, and other signs of men who were up to no good. But they ransacked the whole place and came back with a bunch of supplies. An old lantern, a butcher knife without a handle, a new-looking pocket knife, candlesticks and tin cups, an old ratty quilt, a hatchet, some nails. You know what? I'm not even going to bother describing the rest. Even as I write this, I can't think of a lot of these items that have any importance to the plot, so it amuses me that Twain would take so much time to describe the 20-plus items that they took from that house. Just imagine that they got a lot of useful stuff. So they shoved off from the house, having floated a mile downstream from their island, and they paddled back up with their bounties. Always on the lookout for other vessels, they worked their way back, because if anyone saw them, they were prepared to cover Jim with a blanket to hide him. But this night, they made it home undisturbed, and the next morning, Huck wanted to talk about the dead man they'd found, but Jim said it was bad luck to talk about a dead man who wasn't buried, saying that they may come haunt you. "Ah, shucks, Jim," Huck said. "You think everything's bad luck. You got worked up when I brought in that snake skin the other day, and ain't nothing happened from it." "Never you mind, honey, never you mind. It's a-comin', I tell you, it's a-comin'." And it didn't take long for it to come either, because 3 days later, Huck found a dead snake and thought it would be a funny trick to play on Jim by putting the dead reptile at his feet while he slept. But what Huck couldn't foresee was that the body of the dead snake attracted the snake's mate. So when Jim woke up and jumped, next to the dead snake was a living snake who reactively bit him. So he had to spend the rest of the day sucking blood out of the wound and trying all sorts of home remedies, like having Huck chop off the heads of the snakes, roasting the meat for Jim to take a bite of, and cutting the rattles off and tying them around his wrist. It took 4 long days and nights of Jim dealing with swelling, fever, and other symptoms before his body eventually recovered. Huck felt terrible about all of this coming from what he had thought was just a dumb prank. Once Jim was feeling better, rations had started getting low, and what's worse, Huck was bored. He decided he was going to slip across the river in the canoe and try to figure out what was going on in town, a stealth mission. Jim said he felt that that could be a good idea, except that if Huck was spotted by anybody, they'd both be in a world of hurt. So he suggested a disguise. "What do you got in mind?" Huck asked. Jim just nodded towards a pile of clothes they'd taken off of that floating house, and Huck's eyes landed on a worn girl's dress. And you might think Huck would protest, to such a notion, but you'd be wrong, because Huck Finn was down for a ruse as wild as this. So he rolled his pant legs up until they weren't visible beneath the dress. Then they put a bonnet on his head with a brim so broad that to look at Huck's face was like staring down a stovepipe. Jim and Huck were both pleased with the results, but the escaped slave's only note was that Huck walked like a boy. And stop pulling up the dress to reach into your pockets. Huck sighed and said, fine. He put the canoe into the water just as the sun was going down, and after he'd put down on the Missouri bank and began walking, he approached the first house, which had been empty as far as he had known, but there was a light coming from it, telling him that someone was now living there. Good, he thought. Maybe they're new enough that they won't even recognize me if I weren't in disguise. So he marched up to the door, hoping the resident would have information for him, or her, I guess we should say. Quote, so I knocked on the door and made up my mind I wouldn't forget I was a girl. The encounter with Huck as a girl is humorous, but the woman he meets is not in the rest of the story, so I'll just summarize by saying he learns pretty quickly the only thing we need to know, that most people in town are now convinced it was Jim who killed Huck, and that's why he ran away. And more pressingly, smoke has been seen on Jackson's Island, so a posse of men, including her husband, are gearing up to go investigate. As you can imagine, this puts some urgency in Huck to get back, but not before he gets outed by the woman. The first problem was he couldn't remember her name. He first told the woman that his name was Sarah, and then later he said Mary. So the woman slyly puts him through a series of tests, like asking him to thread a needle or to throw an object at a rat in the corner. And then she reveals that she knows he's a boy because he doesn't act like a girl. But he quickly comes up with a new story, calling himself George Peters, an orphan who had been made a foster child to a mean old farmer 30 miles upriver, and that he's on his way to find his uncle who he can live with. The woman did bite on the lie and decided to help George Peters out, giving him some food for his journey. He thanked her and slipped out to the bank and took off in his canoe to try to get to Jim before the hunting party found him. He hustled Jim into grabbing their gear and loading it on the raft as fast as possible. The canoe was in tow behind the raft. That would be their escape plan if they were spotted. But Huck assumed if the men landed on the island and found the campfire, they would stick around for a while, assuming whoever had made it would be back. And as far as Huck knows, it worked, because they floated downriver all through the night with no problems, putting mileage between them and the town of people who would look at Jim and accuse him of a doubly heinous crime of murder and running away. After resting during the first half of the day, they began to make their raft an actual home on the water. This way, they would be protected not only from rain, but also direct sunlight for too long. And by raising the bed, that meant that the occasional wave from a ferry or steamship that would sweep over the raft wouldn't drench them. They also built a small fire pit, and in case you're wondering, the raft is described as being about 15 by 15 feet, so it would be big enough for all these things. Once they made the raft a decent living space, they proceeded to settle in to life on the river, traveling mostly at nights so that they could hide Jim. And during the day, Huck might sneak into a nearby town and buy some bacon or cornmeal. He was known to take a watermelon or corn from a farmer's field as well. Jim was against stealing, but came around once Huck said they weren't stealing, they were just borrowing. This continued for several days, with no real interactions between them and any other boats or watercraft. By the way, now's as good of a time to mention as any that they have decided the goal is to float along until they get to the bottom of Illinois, where the upper Mississippi meets with the Ohio River at a place called Cairo, which is spelled just like Cairo, Egypt, but regional pronunciation, I guess, is Cairo. And then they will follow the Ohio River up until they get to a free state where Jim can start his new life. So they're just floating easy for a while. It had been more than a week of this when one night the rain came pouring down along with crashing thunder and blinding bolts of lightning. From under their canvas tarp, they saw something unexpected. There was a wrecked steamboat, tilted a good deal on her side, but with the upper decks still above water. Quote, well, it being away in the night and stormy and all so mysterious-like, I felt just the same way any other boy would have felt when I see that wreck laying there so mournful and lonesome in the middle of the river. I wanted to get aboard of her and slink around a little bit. End quote. He tells Jim that they should go check it out, but Jim is against it. But still being inclined to his submissive ways, as most slaves were, he was pretty easily persuaded by Huck to steer the raft to that side of the river. Huck's logic was that going aboard was primarily to raid the captain's quarters. There was likely a bunch of valuables on there. Ferry captains is always rich, he said. They make over $60 a month. He invokes the name of Tom Sawyer, saying that if it was Tom in this situation, and if it was his last mortal act, Tom Sawyer would get on that ferry and investigate. Huck wishes his adventure buddy was here with him right now. But once they got aboard, it was tricky to even get a footing because the angle of the wreck was tilted quite a bit. But by using railings and other objects, they shuffled their way along. Jim mumbled something about feeling sick, but Huck's eyes were wide with excitement. They froze as they heard a man's voice yelling loudly. Jim half turned around, but Huck was already creeping closer to the source. "Oh, please don't, boys. I swear I won't ever tell." Two other men chimed in, telling the first to shut up, and that they were tired of this man's games. One voice said that they know that the begging man, who apparently was named Jim Turner, always tries to get more than his share of the haul by threatening to turn people in if he didn't get more, and they're frankly tired of it. As Huck inched closer, he turned around and saw that Jim was gone. He assumes he must have headed back to the raft. Probably best, Huck thought. But I just want to look at these varmints. Tom Sawyer wouldn't turn around right now. When he got close enough to peek through a doorway, he saw one man laying on the ground, tied at his hands and feet. Two other men stood over him, one holding a lantern, the other a pistol. It seems like the two captors were trying to get up the courage to kill this Jim Turner, but couldn't quite bring themselves to do it. Huck watched as the two debated how to handle the situation. "Don't he deserve it?" one of them asked. "He killed old Hatfield just like this. He's just getting what he deserves, right?" "But I don't necessarily want to be the one who kills him," the other protested. "I've got my reasons." The two men stepped into the same room where Huck was now hiding. The boy had just slipped behind some boxes before they entered. The two men debated how to go about this, or if they should go about it, period. But if they let him live, that Jim Turner would cause a lot of trouble. "I'm unfavorable to killing a man as long as you can get around it. It ain't good sense or morals, right?" Then one of them comes up with an idea. By their estimations, this wreck is not going to last much longer. Within an hour or two, they expected to break free and sink into the river. If the river killed Jim Turner, they wouldn't have to feel the weight of killing him, would they? So they decided to give it a shot. They'll go to shore, and if the boat doesn't break free, well, then maybe they'll have to resort to more violent measures. As soon as they exited the room, Huck escaped out the other side and ran back towards the place he'd entered the ferry. He found Jim there, huddled in fear. "Quick, Jim, there ain't no time for fooling around. If we don't find their boat and take it, two of them is going to kill the other." Huck's goal was to take away the men's boats so they would be trapped on the ferry together. Then he would stop at the first town he saw and get the law to go capture all three outlaws. Jim had some bad news for Huck. The raft had broken loose. So now the only way they were going to get off was to steal the outlaws' boat. By the time Huck found where the outlaws' vessel was parked, it was too late. The two men were loading their gear onto it. One of them yelled to the other to put their lantern out. But before he could, the other man froze a second, later asking his partner, "Did you go through him?" "What? No, did you?" "No." "So he still got his share of the cash?" "Well, come on, we can't leave that much money behind." As soon as the men passed through the door to the interior of the steamboat, Huck slipped into their boat with Jim and cut the line. Neither of them dared to breathe while the boat continued to drift downstream. Huck looked behind them at the wrecked craft until he saw the light from the lantern peeking over the railing. The men's voices yelled over the sound of the water. It was dark enough they couldn't see them. All they knew was their boat was gone. Once at a safe distance, Jim took to the oars, and they tried to make up enough ground to find their raft. But as he turned away from the sight of the ferry, Huck felt pretty guilty, because those men would probably die from this. But instead of law officers to arrest them, the only life that Huck could find fast enough was another steamboat captain, who he told a story about how his family was stuck on the wreck. He was the only one who knew how to swim, so he had come seeking help. And once that captain was rousted into action to get his crew ready, Huck felt a lift on his conscience about those men's lives, and he didn't give it much more thought. But take it all around, I was feeling rather comfortable on account of taking all this trouble for that gang, for not many would have done it. I wish the widow knowed about it. I judge she would be proud of me for helping these rapscallions, because rapscallions and deadbeats is the kind the widow and good people take the most interest in. And after the events of that wrecked ship, Jim and Huck had a little downtime for the next day or two. They had some more spoils from the boat they'd taken from the thieves, clothes, blankets, and most notably, cigars that Huck figured would sell for a nickel apiece. They fill half a chapter with a debate about kings, why there are so many of them, how rich they are, why would a king want a harem full of women when one woman is already a lot to handle? And then it transitions into an argument about language. Huck mentions something about Louis XVI and how his son is rumored to have escaped to America. There might be a king living among them right now. Which, fun little thought that our last novel, Scarlet Pimpernel, touched on this very line. That story did take place before the beheading of King Louis, but only by a couple of years. The convo turns to Jim being confused why a Frenchman wouldn't speak like they do. Huck tries to explain that cats and cows don't talk like they do either, but according to Jim, cats and cows ain't humans, so why is it natural for another human to talk different from them? Note, he's not saying that everyone should speak English, because to him, English is the language of man, and so he's saying a Frenchman should talk like a man. Huck gives up trying to explain it to him, because there's no point in arguing with a man that doesn't understand what he doesn't understand. At this point, they both assume that they have maybe 3 more days until they reach Cairo, the city at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. Once there, the plan was to buy tickets on a steamboat up to the Free States, with Jim posing as Huck's slave. They made it 2 of those 3 days, rather peacefully. But on the second night, a fog rolled in. They figured it would be best to try and go to the shore for the night, but Huck went ahead in the canoe to try to find a place because the raft in the fog was a much higher risk of getting wrecked and doing a lot of damage. The river started to jostle the canoe in a way that made Huck anxious. The fog was so thick, he couldn't even see the raft 20 yards behind him. After another panicked minute, he realized he couldn't even tell what direction he was going in the fog, but he had no clue where the raft was at this point. He gave a whoop, and in a primitive form of echolocation, Huck and Jim exchanged whoops to at least know roughly where each other were. But to Huck's dismay, he couldn't figure out how to get closer. Each time Jim hollered back, it sounded more distant. A current nearly swept Huck into an unexpected rough riverbank, and in his rushed effort to not collide, he lost track of Jim even further. Huck sat still in the canoe, completely engulfed in ghostly white, not a sound, except for the water all around him. Jim stopped replying to his whoops. It took a few minutes for Huck to come to the conclusion that the sudden riverbank he'd almost crashed into wasn't just a riverbank at all, it was an island, and likely Jim had gone down the other side of it on the raft. They were now separated in the fog, with no idea how to contact each other. Over the next hour, Huck sat in silence, occasionally having to paddle rapidly to avoid getting swept into the rocky shore of the island. But his hollers still went unanswered. Keep in mind, at parts, the Mississippi River is almost 2 miles wide, in case you're having a hard time envisioning how they could be that far apart. Eventually, the island seemed to disappear, and Huck was in the middle of a vast nothingness again. The fog was still so thick, and he still heard no whoops from Jim, so he gave into his exhaustion and sat down to take what he thought would be a cat nap. Although, when he woke up, he reckoned it ended up being more than that. Because when he woke up, the fog had cleared, and the stars gave a dull light to the river around him. He scanned the area and noticed one oddly dark speck out in front of him, so he took to paddling, strong and hard, and to his relief, it was the raft. When he climbed back on board, Jim was sitting, arms wrapped around his knees, apparently asleep. The raft had one busted oar, and the surface of it was littered with leaves and branches and dirt. Looks like Jim had had a rough go in the fog as well. Huck, happy to be back, decided to play a trick on his traveling companion, so he laid out on the raft close to Jim, and then, after pretending to be asleep for a minute, he started to stretch and yawn, making enough noise to stir Jim. The ex-slave was astonished to see little Huck back on the raft. He reached out to touch him just to make sure he wasn't a ghost. "What's the matter with you, Jim? You been drinking?" "Well, I just thought you'd never come back," he said. "Come back?" Huck said, looking puzzled. "What do you mean?" Jim shook his head and said something was wrong. He was easily confused, and Huck was trying not to laugh at his own prank. "Wasn't you in the canoe? Didn't we get separated in the fog?" Jim asked. "What fog?" Huck questioned. "Boy, you sure are messed up in the head, Jim," he laughed. Jim shook his head, saying it must have been a dream. Huck then playfully asked him to tell all about this dream of his, and Jim proceeded to tell his side of the story in great detail. And now that he thought about it as a dream, he interpreted the events for what they could mean. Every element meant something: the currents, the island, the fog, the whooping back and forth. Jim actually seemed pretty proud of himself by the end for the level of interpretation he put into it. When he was done, Huck stood up and said, "Well, that sounds pretty good, Jim." And then, with a wry smile, he pointed at all the debris all over the raft and said, "But what do these things stand for?" Jim looked around, and slowly realization set in. Eventually, he looked up at Huck, angry and a little hurt, and said, "What do they stand for? I'll tell you. When I was exhausted from all the work I'd done to keep this here raft afloat and my yelling out to you, I eventually went to sleep with a broken heart because I thought you was gone. I decided to sleep because I didn't care no more what happened to me or the raft. Then I wake up to see you was alive, and I'm so thankful, and all you was thinking about was how you could make a fool of old Jim with a lie. The trash all over this here raft symbolizes what kind of trash a person has to be to enjoy making their friend feel ashamed." With that, Jim crawled into the tent to get away from Huck, and the boy felt bad. "I felt so mean after that I found myself asking forgiveness from a slave, if you can imagine it. But I don't regret it for a minute, and after that I vowed to never do no more mean tricks. I wouldn't have done that one if I'd known how it would have made Jim feel so bad." It took Jim a few hours to start talking with Huck again, but eventually the thought of being close to Cairo brightened his spirits. He started getting excited and told Huck that it made him feverish being this close to freedom. Narrator Huck chips in, "Well, I can tell you it made me all over trembly and feverish too, because until now I ain't really thought about the fact that I was about to be guilty of helping a slave be free." Huck started getting fidgety with how unsettling this was. "You knew he was running for his freedom this whole time," he thought to himself. "Could have warned somebody anywhere along the way." He felt even more guilty, knowing that it was not just any slave, but the slave of the same women who had been so kind to take care of him. "What did those women do to you that made you treat them so mean?" he thought. "I got to feeling so mean and so miserable, I most wished I was dead." I fidgeted up and down the raft, abusing myself to myself, and Jim was fidgeting up and down past me. We neither of us could keep still. Every time he danced around and says, "There's Cairo," it went through me like a shot, and I thought it was Cairo. I reckoned I would die of miserableness. All the while Huck was in his head, Jim was rambling about what he'd do once he was free, how he'd get a job and work his tail off until he had enough money to buy his family. He wouldn't spend money on anything, not one penny. His wife was owned by a farmer about 20 minutes away from the widow and Miss Watson, and he figured if the owner didn't want to sell her, he'd just get some abolitionist to go steal her for him. Huck was appalled. Who was this man in front of him? This slave wasn't even technically free yet, and here he was scheming to team up with abolitionists to steal another man's property. This is what comes from me not thinking, Huck thought, and as he stared off into the river, he decided it still wasn't too late for him to do the right thing. Just then, his thoughts were interrupted by Jim squealing. He was pointing to a place at civilization on the left side of the river and jumping up and down, yelling about Cairo. Huck, who was quick to his feet, said maybe it was, but maybe it wasn't. He'd take the canoe and make sure. Jim hurried to ready the canoe for Huck, and he danced and clapped his hands on the raft, talking about being a free man. "I could have never done it if it weren't for you, Huck," he said as Huck paddled away. "Jim won't ever forget you. You've been the best friend Jim ever had. You the only friend Jim's got now." Huck felt nauseous as he paddled towards the shoreline. He was struggling to understand why doing the right thing felt so wrong. Over his shoulder, he heard Jim continuing to praise him. "There goes Huck Finn, the only white gentleman who ever kept his promise to old Jim." Huck breathed deeply. He had to see this through, but while he was still a long ways from shore, a skiff started heading for Huck. He looked back and saw Jim had already darted out of view. One of the men spoke to Huck. "That raft yours?" "Yes, sir." "Anyone on it?" "Only one, sir." "Well, 5 slaves run off last night, and we're hunting them down. You man black or white?" Huck struggled to get the words out, and after a suspiciously long time, he finally fumbled, "He's white." "Well, maybe we should just go see for ourselves," the man said. But by now, Huck's wits had returned, and he got animated. "Oh, I wish you would. It's my pap, and he's mighty sick. So is Ma and Mary Ann." The men initially agreed to help and started towing Huck's canoe, but the boy kept spinning his yarn. "Pap'll be mighty obliged. Ain't nobody been willing to help us until now." This made the men hesitant. "Well, why is that, boy? What exactly is wrong with your pap?" "Oh, nothing really." "Don't lie to me, boy," the man said. Huck acted like he was really hesitant to say why, and the man decided they didn't want to get involved in whatever illness this man had. They jumped to the conclusion that it was smallpox and started cussing out Huck for lying to them. Huck feigned fear and begged them to just come check out his pap, but the man only had one piece of advice. Float down the river to the next town, and that time don't tell the truth about his pap's illness. But to get out of here now. Oh, and keep your eyes peeled for those runaway slaves. Huck said he would and turned back to the raft smiling at his own cleverness. But pretty quick, he started feeling bad for not having done the right thing and giving Jim up. Then I thought a minute, he says to himself. Hold on, suppose you'd done the right thing and give Jim up. Would you feel better than you do now? No, says I'd feel bad. I'd feel just the same way I do now. Well then, says I, what's the use of you learning to do the right thing when it's troublesome to do the right thing and ain't no trouble to do wrong, and wages is just the same. I was stuck. I couldn't answer that, so I reckoned I wouldn't bother no more about it. But after this, always do whichever came handiest at the time. When he got back to the raft, Jim had slipped into the water in case the men came for him, but he quickly began to thank Huck, saying he'd heard the conversation and was lucky to have a friend like Huckleberry Finn. But then came the bad news. They realized the river was split between the muddy, rougher-looking water that they'd been riding on all this time, and then on the left was a much cleaner-looking water. Both of their stomachs sank as they realized this was the Ohio River water. They had floated past Cairo in the fog that night. They talked it over and realized there was nothing to do at that moment. They couldn't paddle the raft upstream, and they couldn't do much of anything in the daylight. They would have to keep floating until they came to the next town and buy steamboat tickets up to Cairo. And when that night arrived, they kept floating, taking advantage of the cover that it gave them. They lit their old lamp and hung it from a pole, which was typically enough warning for steamboats going upriver to avoid them. But this was not a typical night. They heard the ship pounding at a fast rate towards them. They didn't panic at first because some mean-spirited pilots like to spook other rivergoers, but they watched in terror as this steamboat continued straight for them, showing no signs of changing course. It was almost too late before either of them thought to take action, but in an instant, Huck dove off one end of the raft, Jim the other. Huck scrambled for the shore as the raft was rammed by the steamship. The sound of cracking timbers made Huck feel sick. The ship continued upstream like nothing had happened, and as soon as it had started, it was over. Once on shore, Huck yelled for Jim, but there was no reply. He began to take in his surroundings. He walked for a quarter mile before he found a large double-log house in the quiet of the night, a quiet that was disrupted by a pack of dogs who didn't take kindly to nighttime visitors. A voice called from inside the house, ordering Huck to identify himself immediately. "My name's George Jackson, sir." "What do you mean, and why are you prowling around here?" The dogs were still barking from behind the gate, making it hard for Huck to hear. "I don't want nothing. I wasn't prowling neither. I just fell off a steamboat." There was a pause before the voice replied. "Looky here, boy, if you're telling the truth, you ain't got nothing to worry about. Anybody with you?" "It's just me, sir," Huck said. Suddenly there were noises of people stirring inside the house, including a woman's scolding of the first voice for frightening a poor child to death. Quickly, people came out, shooing the dogs away, and they brought Huck in, wrapping him in a blanket. "Why, he ain't no Shepherdson," a different man's voice said. The woman was still scolding the first voice for having kept a poor child out in the cold that long for questioning. Over the course of the next hour or two, here's what Huck learned. This family was named the Grangerfords. The head of the household was old Colonel Grangerford. There was his wife and their parcel of children. Most were adults at this point. The youngest one wasn't much older than Huck. His name was actually Buck, if that's not confusing enough. The reason they had a pack of dogs and were so suspicious of nighttime visitors is that the Grangerfords were in a good old-fashioned feud with a family called the Shepherdsons, but more on that later. Huck is paired up with Buck, and they become friends fairly quickly. Buck was a cheerful kid who was happy to have someone more his own age to talk to. At one point, there's a funny moment where Huck again forgot which fictional name he'd made up, and so he cleverly avoids another catastrophe by asking Buck if he can spell. And when the boy says yes, Huck bets him that he can't spell his name. Buck says he can too, and then spells out Georgejackson. Huck had just enough schooling to know that spelled George Jackson. And this next chapter contains something that I've picked up from reading enough literature, because at one point, we get a couple pages worth of Huck exploring a parlor room, and it is in vivid detail. And from reading enough books, I've noticed that whenever there is an established pace of the story, and suddenly that gets interrupted by something that's this detailed and seemingly inconsequential to the plot, it's either a conscious or subconscious choice by the author to make their opinion known about something. Because in this parlor room, we get lengthy descriptions of the iconic intellectual and religious books on the shelves, the decorations that are more ornate than the rest of the house, and in the case of the Grangerfords, there was a shrine to a dead daughter of theirs who is described to basically being one of the original goth girls, because apparently Emmeline had an obsession with death and she wrote poems for anyone who died in town. There were grim paintings around the room that she had done as well. All in all, this parlor had a lot going on, and there are parallels between this and a section in Twain's semi-autobiographical volume called Life on the Mississippi, where he describes a house with books arranged not for reading but for aesthetic viewing, columns that were carved to look like Corinthian marble but were made from cheap pine and painted white, homespun art and writings on display. He does all of this to shake his head at what we would call performative gentility. Because in this Southern culture of antebellum that we've already touched on, things of higher class and elevated taste like this were considered part of your status. But in the case of the Grangerfords, they live in a log structure housed in the middle of nowhere, and yet it was very important to them to maintain an image of gentility, and that parlor room was the epicenter of the entire masquerade. So the next time you're reading a story, and it feels like the whole pace gets thrown off by the author getting super specific about something that doesn't seem to bear much weight to the plot, chances are they are making a statement about something. But for our purposes, let's move on to what happened during Huck's time with the Grangerfords. Because actually the next chapter opens with a detailed description of the Colonel himself, which beyond painting a picture of what he looks like, demonstrates what I just said about the desperate desire to appear genteel, even if you are kind of a backwoods family. So here are just a couple parts from those pages. Colonel Grangerford was a gentleman, you see. He was a gentleman all over, and so was his family. He was well born, as the saying is, and that's worth as much in the man as it is in a horse, so the widow Douglas said. His hands were long and thin, and every day of his life he put on a clean shirt and a full suit from his head to foot, made out of linen so white it hurt your eyes to look at it. And on Sundays he wore a blue tail coat with brass buttons on it. He carried a mahogany cane with a silver head to it. There warn't no frivolishness about him, not a bit, and he warn't ever loud. He was as kind as he could be. You could feel that, you know, and so you had confidence. Sometimes he smiled, and it was good to see, but when he straightened himself up like a liberty pole and the lightning began to flicker out from under his eyebrows, you wanted to climb a tree first and find out what was the matter second. The oldest sons of the Grangerford family were Bob and Tom, who were already adults and who were eager to grow up to be just like the Colonel. There was Miss Charlotte, who was 25, a proud woman with looks to match. And then there was Sophia, age 20, who was gentle and sweet. Her smile could melt a boy's heart. Then, of course, there was Buck. The family did own a lot of land. Don't take what I said about performed gentility to think that they were actually lower class, because they did have a lot of slaves to work the land, to the point where they had a slave assigned to Huck for as long as George Jackson was going to be staying with them. One day, Buck and Huck, aka George, were out riding when Buck saw something and pushed Huck into a tree line, telling him to keep quiet. Buck took up his rifle and aimed it at a rider that was plodding along the road. Huck had been around long enough at this point that he did recognize a few of the Shepherdsons by their faces, and this was young Harney Shepherdson. Well, Buck took a shot at Harney, knocking his hat off his head. The rider chased after them with his own gun drawn, but eventually they lost him in the dense woods. When they got back home, the Colonel was not mad that his youngest had fired on the enemy, but only disappointed that he had done so from the cowardly position behind a bush instead of out in the road. Buck complained that the Shepherdsons didn't fight honorably, so why should they? Huck had noticed that Miss Sophia's face had looked concerned during the whole story. She must really care about her little brother's safety, he thought. The next time Huck and Buck were alone, Huck asked what exactly a feud was. And this becomes an amusing and also sad exchange where you think about the fact that feuds may really be held on to for decades after the first incident for reasons as undefined as Buck is about to describe. Why, where were you raised? Don't you know what a feud is? Never heard of it before. Tell me about it. Well, says Buck, a feud is this way. A man has a quarrel with another man and kills him. Then the other man's brother kills him. Then the other brothers on both sides go from one to the other. Then the cousins chip in, and by and by everybody's killed off and they ain't no more feud. But it's kind of slow and takes a long time. Has this one been going on long, Buck? Well, I should reckon it started 30 years ago or summers along there. There was trouble about something and then a lawsuit to settle it, and the suit went again one of the men, and so he up and shot the man who won the suit, which he would naturally do, of course. Anybody would. But what was the trouble about, Buck? I don't know. Well, who done the shooting? Was it a Grangerford or a Shepherdson? Laws, how do I know? It was so long ago. Well, don't anybody know? Oh, yes, Pa knows, I reckon, and some of the other old people, but they don't know now what the row was about in the first place. Has there been many killed, Buck? Yes, right smart chance of funerals, but they don't always kill. Pa's got a few buckshot at him, but he don't mind it 'cause he don't weigh much anyways. Buck then continues to explain the last few deaths on both sides of the feud, leaving Huck puzzled and terrified at the same time. Generations of lives wasted on something that the current generation can't even name. By the way, this feud is based on a real feud that Twain was aware of between the Darnell family and the Watson family. One detail about the real-life feud is that the families lived close enough that they went to the same church, and both families would show up with their guns to worship and stack them on the wall as a way of saying, we come in peace, but we are ready for a fight. And so Twain worked this detail into the story as well, saying that the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons attended the same church, which sets up the Sunday when, after they were home from services, young Miss Sophia approached Huck and said she'd forgotten her Bible at the church house and asked if he wouldn't mind running and getting it for her. Young George Jackson was happy to be of service, so he ran to the church and found the Bible. But as soon as he picked it up, he felt like something was off. What did Sophia need her Bible for so badly? The house had plenty of Bibles. She could have just gotten hers back next Sunday. Out of suspicion, he grabbed the book by the spine and shook it, and out tumbled a scrap of paper with the words 2:30 written on it. There was nothing else. Didn't make any sense to Huck. But when he took the Bible back to Miss Sophia, he watched her search for that very paper. She read it, and then gave the biggest smile Huck had ever seen before bending down and giving him a hug in gratitude. Huck didn't know what to make of it, but he had an uneasy feeling. Later, that same day, the slave that was assigned to Huck said he wanted to show Master George a family of water moccasins he discovered down in the swamp. Huck wasn't sure why he was expected to be so excited to find a bunch of deadly snakes, but he was bored, so he went along with it. Well, when they got away from the house in the dense woods by the swamp, it turned out there weren't any snakes at all, but there was exactly one black man named Jim. Huck was overjoyed to see his friend was still alive. It had been weeks since the steamboat had wrecked their raft. Jim had made it to land that night, but just in time to see the Grangerfords bringing Huck into their property. Jim didn't dare get close enough for the dogs to start barking at him, so he waited until the next day, and he established contact with some of the family's slaves as they went out to do their work. Those slaves had helped keep Jim a secret and get him enough food to survive on until they could arrange this meeting with Huck. Jim tells him the raft wasn't actually destroyed. It did take some real damage, but he's been able to patch it up, and it's ready to go if and when Huck wants to keep on down the river. Huck knows at some point he'll want to take Jim up on that, but for now, he's just having too much of a good time with the Grangerfords, so he tells him to sit tight a bit. Jim looks slightly dejected at this. But the next morning, everything changed. Huck, as the narrator, even writes that he doesn't want to write about this next day in detail because he doesn't like thinking about it. When he woke up, basically everyone was gone from the household. Huck asks his slave Jack what was going on. Miss Sophia ran off with that Harney Shepherdson, Jack said exasperatedly. All of the menfolk had grabbed their guns and horses to set off after the Shepherdsons and stop what in their mind would be an unholy union. Even young Buck. Without thinking of the danger, Huck ran down the road and looked for his friend. The sound of gunshots guided Huck to a tragic scene. Buck and his cousin were pinned down by a handful of adult Shepherdsons on horses. There was one dead body and another injured, so that meant Buck and his cousin were holding their own despite being outnumbered. The men briefly rode off, and Huck used the time to run down and ask what was going on. Buck was sniffling as he angrily shared that his father and 2 brothers were dead, and if it's the last thing he does, he'll kill every last Shepherdson in revenge. Sophia and Harney had already crossed the river, and now the families were wiping each other out in the wake of it. The sound of a gunshot forced all the boys to act. The men had ditched their horses and snuck up from a different angle. Huck ran into the woods for cover, climbing up into a tree. Buck and his cousin jumped in the river. Huck shivered as he heard full-grown men yelling to kill them all. He heard splashing and bullets until the splashing stopped. And after long enough, the men left. I ain't gonna tell all that happened, Huck writes. It would make me sick again if I was to do that. I wish I ain't never come ashore that night. I still dream about that day sometimes. Which, whew, what a change of pace, huh? From carefree traveling and clever encounters of outsmarting adults, suddenly Huck is in the real world, in the way that sobers him up pretty quickly. He waited until it was dark, and then he bolted for the swamp where Jim was hiding, and he begged for them to leave as soon as possible. Quote, "I was powerful glad to get away from that feud, and so was Jim to get away from the swamp. We said there warn't no home like a raft after all. Other places do seem so cramped up and smothery, but a raft don't. You feel mighty free and easy and comfortable on a raft." And that exact sentiment is actually something I want to point out as a theme and symbolism in this book that presents itself fairly neatly for us as a lesson. Because, if you can't tell, we're wrapping up part 1 here. That line right there, you feel mighty free and easy on a raft. You've already seen it so far, and you'll continue to see it more in this book. That when Huck is on the raft, life is simpler. There's no adults bossing him around, no civilization to have to live up to. Anytime he sets on shore, things get complicated. And this symbolism is on purpose. In that same semi-autobiography, Twain writes about how every man, woman, and child has a master they serve. But in his mind, the most free man to ever live was the riverboat pilot. Because it didn't matter that there was technically a captain on board, it was the pilot who actually called the shots. And the river was the most free place a man could be. So even though Huck isn't aboard a ship, he is piloting his own raft down the river, which is more free than any place on dry land. But as Twain also highlights in Life on the Mississippi, the river is also dangerous. He comments that that very romance that he describes about being a pilot of a riverboat disappears the moment you become a pilot, because then you realize how much you are up against. Sandbars, sunken wrecks, or submerged trees, fog, storms, the always changing shape of the river, potential collisions with other crafts, massive storms and tricky currents. The river is wild and dangerous. Huck's already had to live through several of those dangers, so while being on land isn't exactly safe, there is more structure and more predictability to life on land, which serves as a metaphor for anyone who claims they just want freedom in their lives. Because freedom is great. Not having to take orders from anyone else, not spending your time doing things you don't care about. It's a beautiful dream. But with that dream comes danger, because you're on your own. You can't be completely free and be part of an infrastructure or tribe, because those things lay claim on you. If you prioritize absolute freedom, you are 100% responsible for your own survival, which is a lot more terrifying of a prospect than most realize when they dream of being free. Compared to the river, land represents society. There's safety, structure, health insurance, retirement accounts, HOAs, and legal systems to protect your rights. But with those assurances and safeties comes obligation. You become tied to systems and power structures that slowly consume more and more of you, which makes you wish even more that you could be free. These two forces battle each other constantly. And in your life, you probably have had periods more oriented towards freedom and others focused on the annoyingly unfree securities of life on land. Some of us may be more genuinely built for the dangers of being free than others, but as we explore life on the river with Huck Finn, we are constantly reminded that freedom feels great, except for when you feel completely alone to face the trials that come with it. As Tacitus said, quote, "The desire for safety stands against every great and noble enterprise." And as always, I'm not here to say everyone needs to be or even should be one or the other. All I care about is making sure all of you out there claiming to want freedom own up to the truth of the price associated with that liberty. And that wraps up part 1 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We'll be back next week with part 2. Just a reminder, if you are willing to donate to help out my buddy Ben, link is in the episode description to the GoFundMe where you can help out. But for now, this is Jameson signing off of another episode of Becoming the Main Character. Thanks for listening along. We'll see you for part 2 next week.